You're listening to Precinct 444, a podcast network from the National Law Enforcement Museum. Today we're bringing you another episode from the Encore series, where we revisit past museum programs and conversations. Welcome to part 2 of a network of support for lasting change. In our last episode, we met our esteemed panelists and our moderator, who discussed the importance of collaboration and communication between law enforcement and the communities they serve in order to foster effective and lasting change. As you may remember from part 1, each of our panelists holds some kind of stake in the field of law enforcement, whether they are law enforcement officers themselves or they participate in community initiatives that affect the work of law enforcement. In this second part of our discussion, we will hear our panelists dive more deeply into the programs and initiatives they introduced in part 1. They'll elaborate on successful solutions, and they'll reflect on lessons learned from less successful attempts. We return now to our moderator, Axel Threlfall, editor-at-large from Reuters, and our panelists, Chief Jeffrey Glover from Tempe, Arizona, Florence Chung, founder and CEO of Engage Public Safety, the Reverend Markel Hutchins, CEO of Movement Forward Incorporated, and Renee Mitchell, President of the American Society of Evidence-Based Policing.
Reverend Hutchins, one congregation, one precinct, National Faith and Blue Weekend. Give us some examples, some real-life examples of how, where this is working, and then give us some examples of where it isn't working.
So one place that is working is where I am today. I am in Indianapolis, Indiana, in a hotel room. I just finished a news conference with the chief of police, the sheriff, and other law enforcement leaders here. We have developed a piece of technology through the U.S. Department of Justice Community-Based Crime Reduction Grant called Community by Movement Forward. It is a mobile application that does everything that Florence just talked about. We have to communicate with young people through the means of communication that they're accustomed to communicating with. So a lot of times the information, the perspective, the voices of young people are not being heard by law enforcement because law enforcement is not utilizing the communications channels that young people are accustomed to. So in terms of filing a complaint, issuing an officer accommodation, submitting tips, those kinds of things have to be modernized to meet the demands of the American people in terms of the way in which we communicate. So just today, we announced the creation of a best first-class mobile application that will do a lot of exactly what Connie is talking about, but it will also allow us to do some of the things that Renee is talking about, and that is collecting the data. But look, the net of it is we have to have a conversation about being the change that we want to see in the world. Martin Luther King Jr. used to talk about that all the time. We cannot simply stand by and lament law enforcement and the challenges and the need for police reform. We have to be that reform. Chief Glover, I'm working on a project now that I'm feeling very confident about. We need to be utilizing colleges and universities, most especially historically Black colleges and universities, to recruit for law enforcement. We have to encourage these young people, Florence, that it's not enough to simply march and protest. We have to get engaged. We have to become law enforcement professionals. We have to become public servants. So just like we have police, Teach for America, I want to see our nation embrace a program that I'm tentatively calling Police for America, where we encourage young people to get involved, to be the change that we want to see in this world. And that's the way I think that we can turn the corner, can increase enrollment and recruitment of law enforcement professionals, but also be responsive to the needs for police reform and change that we see being passionately advocated in communities across the country.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. And Chief Glover, you could come back to that in a sec, but Renee, I want to bring you back in. We've got a lot of questions coming through on the data bit of this. And, this one's actually pretty close to my heart as well. How do we use facts and data to combat the outright false information that's been pushed by activists and certain media outlets when no one wants to hear facts?
I was going to say that. I'm sorry. Was that for me?
That sounds like a Renee question.
Yeah. Renee, you kick off that.
Yeah, sorry, Chief. I think you have to put your data out there. The problem is, I think with a lot of data and even the research, no matter how you put it out there, people see or hear or pick up on the piece of the data that goes towards the message that they're trying to construe or put out there. I think the best that you could do is to examine your data closely and also to understand it. I think that's sometimes where we've moved so quickly in policing over the last 50 years or so, or even the last 30 years when it comes to data. And our command staffs, as they've moved through the ranks, there's nothing out there on a national scope to train command staff to understand data and analytics. And if you look at all the psychological research, we're not good just as human beings. I'm not even talking as police officers at understanding data and analysis and statistics. It tries our brains very heavily. So for police chiefs or command staffs to go up in front of media or the community who are armed with any kind of statistics and then to be articulate about that, I think in some ways it's a tiny bit unfair because nobody's been trained to do that as a police chief, as they're promoting through the ranks. But also, I think nowadays with a good crime analyst unit, to have them showing the data and to show it in a way, in all ways, show it based on population rates, show it based on how it's broken down geographically across the city, how it's broken down based on gender. But all of those ways, I think, helps convey a message to the public about what's going on in your city. And then the other thing I think people don't necessarily think about is how you visualize your data. Because I think when we push things out in policing, often we give these graphs or charts that can be very confusing. And we're also learning about the human brain, about how we visualize things. If we can create infographics or charts that the public can just easily understand, I think that'll go a long way towards combating the way the media is putting out things and how they're analyzing their own data.
Yeah. Okay. Another question. It's a good one. It puts you on the spot a bit. But what's one set of data that stands out, Renee, to you that the media is not talking about?
Oh, not talking about?
Not talking about. Yeah. Is there something out there that we don't know about? That might be useful in this moving this process forward.
I was going to say that's you might have to give me a minute to think about that one, because I could think about all the things they talk about on the top of my head that I think they skew a little bit incorrectly, but I've never thought about the data that they don't talk about that they should be talking about, because they do talk about the homicide and the violence and how that's been increasing across the country. But I think for me, it's more about the way they talk about the data that I think is incorrect versus leaving out issues or areas that they should be talking about. And that actually could be more of a chief question than a Renee question of what they should be talking about.
Chief Glover, let me put it to you, and I'll. We haven't got Chief Pete on, unfortunately. We're still waiting for him. But when I spoke to him ahead of this, one of the things that stuck with me that he said was, any change is really hard for the old guard, within police departments. Whether it's changing culture, whether it's using new techniques, innovative techniques, new data. How do you do it in your department? How effectively do you do it in your department, and how do you get that word out to all of your people that this is critical?
Well, I think that if you go by the old saying in policing, is that police officers don't like change, but they don't like the way things are either. And that's it's something that we laugh about, but sometimes it is very true depending on what type of change you're trying to make. And so you, when you're trying to get that kind of change, filtered down all the way down to the line level, it's important to be out in front of it and not just sort of make directives or edicts at the very top. You actually have to meet with the people and talk to them and give them the why. This generation that we currently deal with in policing that are coming in, they want to know why they're doing something or why a change, a change is being made. And so that has become very much an important factor in being intentional on explaining why you are making a particular change and where the benefit is for them and the community. You still gear it back towards the community because that's what we're here for. And it's being able to provide that context that helps them walk them through that change that's going to occur.
Yeah. And what about this idea that change is really, really hard for the old guard, not just in your profession, but let's face it, in any profession, and that ultimately change and the right sort of change needs to come from the top. It needs to come from the top down. It needs to come from the bottom up. And if it's not coming from the top down, that's a real problem.
Well, there's also a thing too when it comes to leadership is that there's sometimes where there's a need for individuals within an organization to look up for leadership, but I think that you have to encourage leadership at all levels of the organization. And when you are successful in being able to get people to take ownership of whatever change is occurring, especially at a first line supervisor level and all the way up, that's where it becomes a little bit easier. But you have to be able to get people on board with it, and they have to be able to accept the ownership of that change.
Yeah, and sorry, I will come to the others, but there are some questions coming through specifically on this for the chief. And this comes through. It's not just the police culture that doesn't like change. We all want it. How to make the process of change less threatening is the question here.
Yeah, and again, it comes back to being able to explain the why. That is what I have found, that it actually helps to take some of the sting out of it, or it makes it a little less threatening. Is that when you give the why? Like one of the things that I did here in my organization is that I created an employee advisory group, and so I will still go out and I will still meet with officers and do briefings, hold communication type forums. But I also have a key group of officers, about 16 of them, that I meet with at a line level and first line supervisors. And we actually have conversations before a change is made. And we start, just like in different corporations where we're seeing where they actually have an advisory group to discuss exactly how a rollout should happen. And me as that leader, I want to get that feedback because I want to know exactly what the stumbling blocks are. Even if I think I know what they are, I should know from the line level who is doing the job. I need to know how they perceive it. Because if I know how they perceive it, then that gives me a better opportunity of being able to remove the barriers that's actually going to stop us from being successful in making that change.
Yeah. Okay. Stepping back a little bit, some of the bigger issues, Reverend Hutchins, we talk a lot about reform, training. We talk about community outreach, and I will come back to that as well. But so many questions come through about the need for a change in culture, and that doesn't happen overnight. What are you hopeful about when we talk about a change in culture here?
Well, the thing that gives me the most hope is that we're having conversations like this, and that is very different. And for this discussion to be hosted by our organization, the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund, is a clear indicator that there is a present knowledge of the need for change in law enforcement. And I can't help but piggyback on Chief Glover's point. There's three different sources of change. There's top-down change, there's bottom-up change, but then there's center-out change. And I think if we're going to see the kind of reform and transformation that we want to see, that will not only transform the culture of law enforcement, but transform the culture of policing as an industry, as a profession, if you will, we've got to see all three levels of change. And we do that by increasing the appetite in the American people for actually engaging with law enforcement, for actually getting involved in these issues. And we cannot do that as long as we're reduced to yelling and screaming at each other. We have to find a way, and I keep going back to this, to work collaboratively around our commonalities and not remain so divided by our differences. Look, I come from a background as a civil and human rights leader. I've led dozens of high-profile police controversy, marches, and demonstrations. But today I sit on the board of the National Police Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund because I recognize the solutions to the challenges that we face in America today won't come through a piece of legislation, through an executive order. They have to be personal. I say this all the time. The changes that we want and the reforms that we seek are not a matter of policy, but they're a matter of transformation. We won't see the changes we want in this country just by an executive order, a piece of legislation. It will come through the transformation in the hearts and minds of the American people and the American police officer. But that can only happen when we have the courage and capacity to engage one with another. Am I right about that, Florence?
Yeah, Reverend Hudgens, I echo everything you said, and I'll add one more thing. I think when you said center out, a lot of times law enforcement will get together, and the law enforcement related think tanks and those in the profession will get together and talk about how to bring about change, what's next, how to bring about reform. But I think there's value in reaching outside the industry as well, or reaching into corporate America to see if there are business practices and ideas and innovation that can be translated into the law enforcement profession, reaching out to different groups that normally may not be interested or engaged in the public safety arena, such as younger people. I talked about the millennials and the Gen Zers. They were the ones out protesting. They definitely want to see change. I think we have an opportunity here for law enforcement to really strategically engage them, right? They've got they've got the energy and the passion, but they also have the decades ahead of them in life to usher in the change that we would like to see in the years ahead. And so engagement, Reverend Hutchins, I agree with you, getting them involved. There are a lot of people who did not really have an interest in law enforcement or public safety prior to 2020. And because of the moments that were created last year, they are coming out and saying, we want to see change. How do I get involved? But a lot of them may not know the answer to the question, how? And so I think there are a lot of different community groups and police departments, nonprofits that can initiate programming and outreach to engage those that want to be involved. And I think we can see a lot more effective change come out when we engage those that have been emerging in the last year.
That was actually, you asked me earlier, that was the impetus for our creation of National Faith and Blue Weekend. Mm-hmm. There are 350,000 houses of worship in the United States of America. 65 million Americans attend some form of a faith-based service every week. Those are mass gatherings by the 350,000. Those congregations, those community organizations should be goodwill ambassadors and force multipliers to do exactly what you just said, Ms. Chong, and that is engage the community with law enforcement. So we've got to continue to do creative things like that. Some of the things that we're working on at the museum will allow us, but this is a process. It won't happen overnight. We didn't get to this place overnight. It took decades to get to this powder keg moment, and it's going to take us some time to come out of it. But we have to remain committed.
Yeah, and Florence, I want to come back to the point about involving the business community as well. Can you give us some examples of where that is happening effectively, if indeed it is happening effectively in the US? Because it's an interesting proposition, and I'm amazed that we're only talking about it now, or have we been talking about this for a long time?
It doesn't happen very often, I'll tell you, but I'll give a couple different examples. Right. So, many years ago, I was with Target, the retailer, and we're a big supporter of law enforcement. And within that organization, they piloted a program called it was a business fellowship, bringing in a lot of police chiefs, and many people in this audience may have heard of that program. It lasted for a few years, and the whole concept was to bring police chiefs from across the country together with corporate executives to have some sort of peer mentorship program, right? And so, especially in the last year, my colleagues and I have been thinking through, the opportunities, the prime opportunities for corporate America, who have been making big pledges throughout the last year on how to address racial equity and things like that. Could they play a role in building up initiatives to put business leaders, business best practices together with law enforcement executives? Could there even be a CEO to police chief peer mentorship circle, right? Well, I have not seen these. We would love to be a part of. If anybody wants to initiate things like this, it would be, I think, very value added. But also there was a climate, right? The climate that we were dealing with in the last year where it was almost difficult, or dealing with or working with law enforcement for many businesses and corporations was tricky because of the narratives and the polarized narratives across the country. But I think there will be a time in the future when businesses and companies can share their resources, expertise, and knowledge base with law enforcement.
And the data, of course, Rene, the data is a big part of that, and because a lot of this, of course, can come from the private sector as well, I imagine, and the ways of doing. But I'm not allowed to editorialize, so I mustn't. I've got to stay as impartial as I can here. But it does surprise me the lack of business involvement and collaboration between the two sides. I know traditionally business is supposed to remain apolitical, but we've kind of moved beyond that now in many ways, right? Reverend Hutchins.
Yeah, I can't agree more. One of the things that is really, and I'm going to be very transparent, one of the things that is really of great concern and disappointment to me in this moment, Chief Glover, is that there are a whole lot of corporations and business interests and a whole lot of foundations who have bought into this zero sum, in order for someone to win, someone has to lose mentality that we see pervasive in our national politics. So for a lot of corporations, they somehow believe that you can't support and fund racial equity and quality policing at the same time, when in my estimation, companies that are doing business in communities where crime and violence is of concern, as well as police reform, have an obligation to invest on both sides of these issues. It can no longer be where corporations simply invest in Black Lives Matter causes that are anti-police or defund the police. There's a place for their support in those communities, but there's also a need for them to invest in quality policing, community collaboration projects that actually move the profession closer to a more just and equitable industry. Mm-hmm. So there are issues, but corporations and unions and funders and everybody has a role to play, and we've got to stop. Corporations should stop, I should say, this pervasive zero-sum funding.
Yeah, and Chief Glover, I'll come to you in a second. But Rene, do you want to say anything about the business side and the corporate side and the role that they might play on the data side as well?
Well, It's funny, actually, Florence and I don't know if you remember, that is how we met at SAC PD a long, long time ago, is when you were with Target. Is my agency actually was part of the Target program and did a little bit of the work trying to bring the business side into the Sacramento Police Department in that aspect. But if you look at, I think one of the things that's really difficult, and the chief could probably speak to this too, with a lot of aspects of not just the data, but really the research that's out there in the field. And I'm not talking about just like the business aspect of it, but like the psychological research, sociology, and a ton of other areas where there's research. There's a lot of difficulty of bringing it into the policing side. One, we have a lot of limitations, and our city councils and or city managers direct a lot of what we can and can't do within our organizations and our budgets. And then two, there's also sometimes what you see. So take, for example, my agency with Target, you have certain leadership that have their beliefs and values. But if they're shifted out of a unit, or if they leave to go to another department, because there's a lot of rotation in policing when it comes to promotion. So you might only have a chief that's your chief for 3 to 4 years. And the minute that chief rotates out, you might have a whole nother set of values and beliefs. And I don't mean like, of course, our core values and beliefs in policing is always, the community and safety and those things, but how you go about approaching that can shift. So a lot of times when you have through the ranks that happening over and over again, you sometimes do have the younger or the mid-level officers who are just like, I will wait out till this next leadership moves on if it is something they don't care for, or maybe they do grasp hold of it because it does align with their values, but then that chief leaves and then they're left, kind of in the wind when the new chief comes along. So we have some of these cultural issues within policing that sometimes inhibit us from doing things the way business does them. But besides the business world, there is so much research that could probably better support what we do in the field versus the way we're doing things now.
Oh, sure. Chief Glover, very quickly, any good examples of you working with local business?
So I think one of the best examples that I have for working with local businesses within the city of Tempe is that we have a great relationship with Starbucks. We, for years, have been doing coffee with the cop, and we had an incident here where some officers felt disrespected in one of the stores. They were asked to leave because the customer didn't feel comfortable with 3 or 4 officers that were sitting in a group. And so what ended up happening is that it ended up creating a strong bond and a great relationship with Starbucks, where they have offered assistance to us in several different areas or aspects of what we were doing in terms of training and with our de-escalation program. They've become a good partner for us, in that area. And so, I think that's a good example of some of the work that's being done. And we've also had a relationship with Target and utilizing grants, things of that nature for our crime prevention programs as well. And when we have time, I definitely want to get into, the whole aspect of culture and changing hearts and minds as well.
Thank you for listening to part 2 of our program, where we took a deep dive into this collaborative approach to creating change in the field of law enforcement, and to gaining a greater understanding of how law enforcement and the communities they serve can work together to better shape a model of policing that works best for their individual needs. Coming up in the 3rd and final episode of A Network of Support for Lasting Change, we will look at how these realizations are helping us turn ideas into action. Our panelists will discuss community programs they have witnessed and make recommendations based upon their findings. Thanks to Anna Muckenfoos for helping to write today's program and Christopher Mitchell for producing. And many thanks to you for listening to this episode of Encore, a Precinct 444 podcast from the National Law Enforcement Museum. We hope you will join us for part 3 as we finish revisiting our program entitled A Network of Support for Lasting Change. Please subscribe to Precinct 444 on your favorite podcasting platform to stay connected and to receive our latest content as soon as it drops. And we would love to hear from you. Send in your questions, comments, and feedback to precinct444@nleomf.org. You can help us make our content even better. The National Law Enforcement Museum is located at 444 East Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., and is dedicated to telling the story of American law enforcement. We expand and enrich the relationship between law enforcement and the community through educational journeys, immersive exhibitions, and insightful programs. Find us online at lawenforcementmuseum.org. Until next time, stay safe. We'll see you at the precinct.